first session will be and the discussion concentrating around how to fill the biomedical countermeasures pipeline. And we will start with an industry perspective, where it's Johan van Hoff, who works at Johnson & Johnson, will give the perspective. So, and then we move to the panel. So the floor is yours, Johan.
Thank you very much. First of all, I really would like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to do this talk today. So my name is Johan van Hoof. Sometimes people are confused. They talk about Johnson & Johnson, Janssen & Janssen, and other things. Johnson & Johnson is an integrated healthcare company which essentially has three divisions: consumer, devices, and healthcare. And healthcare is actually called Janssen. And so I'm working for Janssen, and there I'm leading the vaccine division. So this is actually a slide that I took from my archives when I went stimulated by my boss, Paul Stoffels, to go to the board of directors back 10 years back and to make the point that we should be as an integrated healthcare company in the field of prevention and vaccines. Making the statement that infectious diseases is still an almost unpredictable but major health threat to the world, and that it is influenced by four major factors. Population dynamics, an aging population, particularly vulnerable to infectious diseases. There is the intensive travel, there is the climate aspects, and there are also the mega cities. And so I took it because it's a slide that I used 10 years back. Then, since then, of course, long before that, we had the SARS epidemic. There was the flu pandemic in 2009. There was also Ebola in 1416. And there was the Zika virus epidemic. And going back to the factors before, why was Ebola such a nightmare? Clearly, if it would have happened in a rural area, it would have been much faster under control. But happening in these huge cities, which are really very badly organized with crowded people, was very difficult to go for contact tracing and so on. So these mega cities really contribute. If you see Zika creeping up in the US, same for dengue also, the climate clearly has an influence. And of course, most recently, we all know about what's happening in Nigeria for the moment. Now, being prepared, we already talked a lot about that this morning, and what are the critical factors that need to come together to make preparedness effective? And I think we talked about all of them. You need to have access to the diagnostics, you need to have your surveillance systems, you need to have your reporting communication systems, you need to have clear interaction and intervention, and then also when it happens, you need to have access to, what do you do to treat, eventually supportive. For Ebola, unfortunately, only supportive care was available, but was shown to be very important to increase survival rates. But also you would like to have a curative treatment, an antiviral if it works. You want to go to the infection prevention control guidance, behavioral situation, but also you would like to have access to vaccines. And all of this is clearly the work of many stakeholders, both in the public and the private sector. But when we talk about industry, I think the public is looking to the areas circled here, which is really developing diagnostics, getting access to treatment, antivirals, or getting access to vaccines. And that's really what I would like to focus on in this talk. Now, of course, it's important to know that the ecosystem is very important and many stakeholders are involved, and it's only by having a good teamwork between these partners that you can really come to a successful intervention. And I think it's important to mention all of these, the supranational organizations, and I'm referring back to my Ebola experience where WHO has been playing a critical role. The local health authorities, we should not underestimate the importance of getting them on board as well early and starting clinical trials in these countries to get the local regulatory authorities on board. Certainly with under-resourced authorities over there might be a challenge, and there we really have been very lucky to capitalize on the support of WHO, who was actually coaching AVAREF, the regulatory network in Africa, to make this happen. and also with the help of EMA and FDA was really good to see this happen. Local health infrastructure is very important. We work especially in Sierra Leone, where more than half of the doctors actually were impacted and the hospitals were just closed. And so working in such an environment is pretty challenging. Collaboration from the NGOs, and certainly the work in the field of antivirals or treatment, the colleagues from MSF have been extremely critical. Important is the clinical research infrastructure. And going there back at the time of the outbreak, in a country that has limited or no clinical trial experience, coming in and imposing clinical trials is a challenge. And so in an ideal world, you really, lessons learned, we need to think about how to be better prepared there. Industry is important, but it's also the community engagement is really very important, and making sure that we tackle this up front and we are not imposing vaccination, but we really make sure that with the local community leaders, we go through that thinking process on why it is best beneficial to have communities participating. I'm referring to the Ebola experience, but currently we are doing an efficacy trial with an HIV vaccine in Southern Africa. And there also, I had the luck to be there 2 weeks ago, it's so critical to have the buy-in from the local communities, because without that, if you just come in as a Western person and say, here's the vaccine, you need to test it, this will never work. Okay, being prepared, what does it mean from a company perspective? And being in charge of vaccines, I'm going to focus on vaccines. But of course, it's also applicable to the other things we just said for industry. It is applicable to some extent to development of diagnostics, to development of antivirals. And I would like to give 4 perspectives. The overarching company perspective, looking to the board of directors, the shareholders, who are expecting in this operational model a return on investment. From an R&D perspective, it's more my shop, where I see the challenges. From a supply chain perspective, manufacturing, and last but not least, about policies and practices, the environment that we have to work in. We should not forget that normally a vaccine is only developed when there is a reasonable chance to make it happen, when it addresses a high unmet medical need, and where there is a reasonable chance to have some level of return on investment. Of course, in situations where there is no or limited return, companies have been engaged in these activities, and then it's more part of the social corporate responsibility. But we have to realize that that type of money cannot be spent unlimited. There is a ceiling to this because it needs to be sustainable longer time. And because all of this, I've seen in discussions with colleagues from industry that unlike we really find a way to better work together, and I'm talking about the situation 3 years back, I think we make progress, there is actually a risk that the burden on the industry is so high that overall we might consider even not longer being engaged in that type of research. So from an R&D perspective, it's clear that we really need to make sure that we are realistic and that we manage timelines. And certainly time is of the essence here when an epidemic is running. And therefore, as you will see in lessons learned, we should do as much as possible between the epidemics rather than during the epidemic itself. It's also important to realize that very often we talk about pandemic preparedness, but each virus might have its own characteristics, and I'm not sure that a one-size-fits-all approach would be tenable. There is a high level of uncertainty. When we started with the Ebola experience, the good news was there was really an extreme positive thinking of all the stakeholders involved of we want to do something, we really want to help the world. The challenge was, okay, how are we going to do it? What is the pathway to come to licensing? And I'll come back to that in a minute. There's a huge discussion about clinical studies design. In the early days of 2015, there was a huge debate about the pure scientific approach, which is placebo-controlled randomized trials, which from a statistical scientific perspective is probably the best approach to take. But it has to be balanced with ethical considerations about, yes, but if you do that in these countries, and there was clearly an area of tension between the conservative thinking and the people in charge of people or the communities over there. The pathway towards local approval of clinical trial applications, we really had in some countries big concerns from the authorities who really delayed the start of studies with several weeks, sometimes even several months. And there is a lot of challenges about getting clinical trial material in, getting blood samples or biological samples out. And the biggest question mark is, and I'll come back to that, can the efficacy really be demonstrated? Something which we should not forget is that vaccine development, if you do it in the traditional way, you go through the phase 1, you go to phase 2, you have several hundreds to thousands of exposures before you go in a full-blown efficacy study. And even then, you are not certain you will not have an unexpected serious adverse event. However, in this setting where you want to do everything in record time, where you want to do it in an environment where the monitoring of the vaccinees might not be optimal because of limitations of the environment there is a risk that all of a sudden SAEs pop up or you might miss them. And so we really need to reflect on what it means, because there is a risk that if you're using some of your innovative platforms for these applications, that it taints back on your own platform and you really have not the right tools to work up that case in detail. The other part is the whole discussion about IP and protection of know-how, and you certainly want, and it's certainly I know Janssen does, but also colleagues from other companies, want to make sure that we make state-of-the-art technologies available for these difficult to prevent infections, but these platforms are also used for other commercial interesting vaccines. So we really need to find a way to ring-fence the know-how and the IP around this to protect also the commercial assets. And something which we should not forget is that these type of emergencies are not planned. It comes on top of everything that is planned in your overall chain of R&D. So there is this very significant opportunity cost. You want to put your best people on this, and so automatically you see some pressure on your pipeline. Also for manufacturing, right at that time there was a talk about stockpiles, but I don't think we ever agreed on what is a stockpile. Is it 10,000 doses? Is it 100,000? Is it millions? And that's also the type of thing I think that we need to make progress on. You also need to realize that if your operations are really running efficiently, you cannot afford to have a lot of idle capacity. So if all of a sudden, and now I'm talking about another example, flu, I know it from colleagues from Sanofi and from GSK, once a pandemic flu breaks out, you really need to replan completely your supply chain, and then it might actually have negative impact on other vaccines, of pediatric vaccines or other, that will have discontinuity in supply. Last but not least, process qualification is a very technical discussion. I want to go into detail, but it's also very time-consuming, resource-consuming, and I'm personally thinking that for stockpiles, we need to have a debate to what extent this is really needed. The regulatory requirements, stockpile, full study conduct, full licensing. There's a lot of, certainly at the beginning, a lot of unknown about where we are going with this. How will the vaccine be used? Because how it will be used also should, in theory, influence the way you develop it. And is it to be used at contact? Is it to be used really as preventive? Is it the population, for instance, for Ebola? Is it the frontline workers, the healthcare workers, the people who work with the diseased people, etc.? Liability is an important one, to the point that I made before. And the last point I already commented on. Okay, let's now illustrate this on Ebola. Ebola, we actually, before doing that, I want to go back to October 2014. And some of you might have been present in that meeting in Geneva, where it was in the midst of the crisis, and all of the stakeholders came together. And for me, it was really a very unique experience. I really feel that that day, we all were there with a joint objective, which is we're going to fight Ebola. We're going to solve this together. Whether we were in industry, in private, whether we were FDA or EMA, whether we were WHO, there was that joint thinking. And this was the start of a very intensive period of weeks where we had weekly telecoms on how are we going to make it happen. interesting, and this report is still on the website, and people interested should actually go to that, because it's interesting to see how ambitious that passionate team was at that moment. And then if we now have to check the boxes of what was delivered, I'm not sure we can cross all the boxes, to be honest. But so there was the statement, okay, to industry, we know there's several candidates, it's better to have several shots on goal, let's all go for it, we will find the funds. With regard to liability, it was said to industry, don't worry, we'll find a solution. The good news is that I think we are now close to the solution, but it's several years later. The other one is, but again, I want to say it was a very positive experience, because everyone was really united, and there was also determination to finish the job. And I think that as the Ebola epidemic waned, that enthusiasm and that passion almost declined at the same level to some extent. And I think it's important, and fortunately there have been some initiatives to make sure we don't forget the last obligation, which is, or the commitment, let's indeed make sure that we finish the job. What is now the Janssen Ebola story? Actually, we were involved in collaboration with NIH, and this was done in the context of bioterrorism, where an Ebola vaccine was targeted to be developed, multivalent, protecting against 3 viral viruses. And over the years, more than 10 years, we have had several vaccine candidates, several generations of candidates, every time looking at better protection. There's also a lot of work that has been done on, is there an animal model that is predictive of what would happen in humans? And that is still today a big question mark, but there certainly is an animal model which has 100% lethality within a few days' time. So back in the summer of 2014, we actually had the good news that we had 2 vaccine regimens that were 100% protective in animals. And when we saw in the press the reports about Africa, I contacted Paul, and we said, okay, will this vaccine eventually be part of the solution? So at that moment, the board of directors said, they gave us a lot of money, go for it, and we decided to stop the multivalent vaccine and really focus everything on the monovalent vaccine. And then in record time, we actually went into a partnership with Bavarian Nordic, another partner, and also remarkably, we were able to connect very rapidly through all of these satellite meetings with funders who actually were prepared and interested in helping us to come to a solution. And that's where I remember a very hectic time where we worked very closely together with IMI to have all the contracts ready for collaboration together with the London School and INSERM in France. We also had later on funding from BARDA. And so if you look to the entire trajectory, at the end of the day, if everything goes according to plan, we roughly will have had really a great public-private partnership, 50% funded by ourselves, 50% funded by the public partners. What we now see is that based on what we know today, we actually, and I'll come back to that, we are currently in discussion with the regulators. We have a handshake agreement on what the regulatory pathway is, and we should be able to have the job finished somewhere, stockpiling in somewhere in 2019 and full licensure somewhere in 2021. Due to that collaboration, we were able to roll out many studies, more than 10 studies, more than 5,000 people vaccinated. It's an old slide, actually, it should be 5,000. And we actually have accumulated a lot of data, immunogenicity and safety data. And we were very happy to see, and this is published in JAMA, that we were able to induce a very solid immune response that also was pretty sustainable up to 1 year. We now have 2-year data that really look very good. For sake of time, we have similar data for the cell-mediated immunity results, and they also look similarly good. But now we actually were planning to go very fast into an efficacy study. The problem is that, and even having had a candidate vaccine that works in animals already, by the time that the outbreak was there, before you get into being able to start such an efficacy study, you need to have your phase 1 and 2 data. So by the time that we were ready to start the proof of concept, there was no Ebola left. It was good news for the world, but very challenging for vaccine manufacturers. And actually there was an advisory committee in May 2015 with the FDA, and the title of the question at that advisory committee was already, hey, we see that, and happily so, epidemic is declining. How are we going to solve that problem? And so in absence of efficacy data, what you want to do is you actually make a comparison of the immune responses that you induce in animals, and that through immune profiling, you analyze mechanistically what is the mechanism of protection in these animals, and then you bridge that immunogenicity towards the immune profile that you see in humans. This sounds very simple on paper. We are in discussions with the FDA since 2 years about how to do that statistically in a valid way. I think we now have an handshake agreement, but certainly it's something which is very challenging. The other thing is that you don't know how predictive that model is for the human situation. We think that this model is pretty conservative. All of the animals die within 7 days, as opposed to, so the incubation time is longer, it's much shorter than in humans. The fatality rate is 100%. And for these reasons, we believe that what you see in these models is probably an underestimate of what you would have in humans. And I was very pleased to see that a few months ago, close to a year ago, I think we had a meeting in Washington that has as a title, Finish the Job for Ebola, and I think there's now growing consensus indeed that this is the case, and that these data are reassuring to say this will be protective in people. So thanks to that public-private partnership, we really were able to progress a lot. We have submitted to WHO what I would call an emergency file. We have, and depending on the data, sometimes you will see that we mention 2 million doses. This is 1.6 million doses filled, ready to go. 400,000 still need to be filled. That is, so we have 2 million doses ready, of which 1.6 released and ready to go if there would be an outbreak. It's important to stress and to thank really the great partnership from the European Commission through the IMI initiative, also from colleagues from NIH, from BARDA and many others, together also with our academic partners who actually have been running this study, London School in particularly, who has done it with us in Sierra Leone, where today we are still running the pediatric program. Now, one thing which we have learned from this is also that platform experience. Once you have done this and you use a platform that you're very familiar with, your vector becomes a plug-and-play approach. And so with the Ebola experience, we now can take out the gene and we put in the gene for Zika expression. And between the moment that we started discussing with Dan Baruch from Harvard on a potential Zika vaccine, within a year we were in the clinic. And actually, I hope that on my desk when I'm back next week, I will have the phase 1 results of our Zika vaccine. So having a good platform really helps. And also regulators like to see platform experience because they know that the reactogenicity profile is largely linked to the backbones that you used. So the more data that you accumulate, the more comfortable you are to start a new vaccine using that platform. Okay, since Ebola, there have been many sessions about lessons learned, and I just have Googled a bit, and these are several of the publications that actually have made many of the points that I made today. One of the points raised earlier today is also about the governance of patient populations. If you have several candidates ready, how would you do it? And I don't have the solution, but probably this is the type of questions we have to reflect on in peacetime, such that everything is ready at the moment there's an outbreak and that you can really effectively go for this. Now, there have been 2 major initiatives where we also have been closely involved, which is WHO really want to make sure that there is a reflection on are there platforms that can help us to go faster in the future, which is the R&D Blueprint platform, and where we were selected together with the colleagues of the Jenner Institute in Oxford. And people might have seen this publication by Stanley and also Jeremy from the Wellcome Trust, where they actually made a plea that to avoid the disaster of Western Africa happen again, let's make sure that we create something, multinational or supranational type of mechanism that can incentivize this type of research. And that is where actually, probably you all are aware, of the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, which really has as an ambition to be somewhat the integrator/catalyzer, work in collaboration with other funders and the European Commission, the Gates Foundation, the ministries, to make this happen. It's still early days. I think we are suffering from some growing pains, but overall, I think this is really going in the right direction. So there are several possibilities here to close the gap, and since Ebola, there have been quite a lot of initiatives. I want to mention here again, for instance, the Advanced Market Commitment, which is an initiative that is driven by Gavi to some extent, but also on the procedural side. We know we have been discussing on liability. We actually had very soon in the crisis, the US government actually granted us a special status. It was not only us, the Ebola vaccines and the development were granted a special status that exempted us from the liability question and actually put it at a government level. It looks like we might find a similar mechanism now for territories outside of the US. The disease prioritization is something which has been happening. At some moment, I think there were many priority lists circulating, but gradually we are coming now to some consensus about how to attach those. Now, in the part which is actually, this part is actually what is covered in principle by CEPI, but not only CEPI. We have been able to do this thanks to the collaboration with IMI, with the European Commission, with EBODAC, EBOMAN, and the other initiatives. The question is for the future on what happens here, because today there is a draft of a solution to make sure that we get up to having sufficient vaccines. So you do phase 2 studies, and you actually look then into, is this vaccine safe to use? You're bridging it with animal protection data. You look to the immunodata in human, and you also hopefully can come to the conclusion safe to use, and based on that immunobridging with animals, it's likely to be effective. And then there could be, but this is not a mechanism fully validated today, conditional approval for emergency use with a stockpile that's somewhere in the freezer, and then when there is an outbreak, it could be used. And that is where today there is still quite some discussion around what should that setting be. The progress is, I think, that if we don't have an outbreak tomorrow, because it still will take some time, in a few years we should be able to have stockpiles in the freezer for MERS, for Nipah, for Lassa. And then when there's an outbreak, what do you do? And I think it's really very important that there is a discussion about the design, and that this design is agreed upon before the outbreak happens, that we have engaged with the communities, that ideally there was a clinical trial network in place such that everything can be rolled very quickly. There should be a discussion about the sizes of the stockpiles, and again, I think one size doesn't fit all. And also, today the big question mark is, okay, suppose that you have a stockpile, suppose that it has shown to be effective in that setting, what is next? Do we need to go to full licensing? How is that funding going to happen? Because very often in these discussions, you hear that many experts will say, well, we might have these in the freezer for years, and perhaps we will have to use it once or twice, but it will never be large volumes. It's a hypothesis, but it's something that needs to be said. Now, one thing is certain. It will come back. The problem is we even don't know what will come back. And so that is why it's so important that we continue to be prepared. Therefore, I think that the lesson learned from Ebola and the great momentum that has been created and the great public-private partnerships that have been created, let's make sure that we foster that and leverage that momentum created to keep the dialogue going and really acting as partners. Let's also look into, it was great to have the funders. Would even be great if we can find ways to make these funds complementary to each other and that also funding mechanisms and the administrations around it are somewhat harmonized such that the burden is minimized to all stakeholders involved, both on the funding side but also on the receiving side. We need really to intensify the discussion on the remaining gaps, because today we have 1.6 million regiments in the freezer. If tomorrow there's an outbreak in downtown Kinshasa, nobody knows today on how those are going to be used. And whether it's a vaccine from us or whether it's a vaccine from Merck, there is the same challenge. I think also it's important that the governments prepare themselves for timely preparedness, and that we are aware that vaccine manufacturing is not something that you can push on a button and you have a vaccine later. The lead times for many vaccines, there is some new promising technology that might change this, but lead time for vaccines can be very long and foster public-private partnership. And with that, I really would like to thank you. Thank you.
So thanks, Johan, and I would now like to invite the panel to come to the table. And so the next panel will be chaired by Stefan Schreck, who is head of unit in DD Santé, and myself. So please.
Yes, okay. Good afternoon. So welcome to the panel discussion, which is actually about filling the medical countermeasures pipeline and industry perspective. Yes, we have first short interventions by which are very interesting, promise to be very interesting from very interesting people. So the first one is from Florent Séjourné, who is the CEO of Da Volterra and also the president of the BEAM initiative. Please, you have the floor.
It's okay. No. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the invitation. So I'm indeed the Chief Executive Officer of a biotech company located in France, in Paris, called Da Volterra. And at Da Volterra, we develop products which prevent the actions of antibiotics on the microbiome, on the intestinal flora, in order to minimize future risk linked to this antibiotic dysbiosis in the gut. And indeed, 2 years ago, I've decided to suggest to SMEs, biotech companies in the field, targeting antimicrobial resistance, to regroup together in an association, and we have funded the BEAM Alliance. So today we gather 45 companies in 12 countries in Europe. 60% of us develop new antibiotics, 40% of us develop alternative treatments to antibiotics or preventing tools like what I'm developing myself. Here in the debate today, I only have the innovation industry, small industry focus. I'm not talking about stewardship or detection or surveillance, which are all very important measures, but only innovative product measures. And why have we decided to regroup each other is because most of us develop 1, 2, 3 products only, and we're like from 10 to 50, 100 employees only. And so it's difficult for us to speak up for everyone. And we decided to talk all together. We represent today more than 100 products in development on the European soil, about 500 employees working in the private field. So it's not something as big as a big pharma itself, but when you look at what's going on in the antimicrobial resistance field, we probably represent a lot of efforts developing new products. What is the issue for biotech companies in that field today is that we're facing this complex paradigm, the new paradigm of antibiotic research. In the 80s, this field was pretty interesting for big pharma. There was large revenues, but definitely today, with the development of resistant infections, it's getting much more complex on the business model side. And everyone knows about this. There has been a lot of work, especially from the European Commission since 2009 in various reports showing the issue of the business model of innovation in that field. And definitely the markets there are not as solid as before. We have doubts on the future pricing, volumes of sale of those products. So we are private companies. We need to move forward towards reliable value for our companies and product. And at this stage, there are uncertainties. So it's a field where new business models need to be thought. It actually looks a little bit like vaccines because it's cases where you can't really predict. It's limited people having resistant infections. It's a lot about prevention as well. And basically, we live in a different world as biotech companies working in AMR, as our colleagues working in oncology innovation, inflammatory product innovation. I mean, they have access to venture capital money, they have access to business models which are solid, which is not exactly our case. So the objective with the BEAM Alliance is really to speak up and try to change the paradigm in order to sustain the business model, to have sustainable business models for our companies. One important comment that I would like to make is it's not all the markets for those innovative products will be wide. And probably a few SMEs, mid-sized companies, will end up selling their own products. So we are either future partners of the pharmaceutical industry or we are future champions for novel innovation. And in that context, it's not exactly the same support. So recently, especially those last 3 years, there have been a lot of reports. WHO has made reports. In Europe, there has been a very interesting consortia called DriveAB, trying to recommend countermeasures, especially economic countermeasures, to support that research. In the USA, there have been many actions. There has been a very interesting initiative called CARBEX. There is a team within the United Nations exploring that path of antimicrobial resistance. And all of those groups, and as well as London School of Economics, academic research, they have suggested incentives. And the outcome of those reports are pretty clear. To support innovation in the field, you need both push and pull incentives. Push meaning grant-type money, pull meaning market-type incentives. And at this stage, we're at the level where many reports have been made, and the DriveAB report, which was expected by the European Commission to move forward, was published in January, so it's a very recent report work. And so we're moving forward today to not only making reports, we're moving forward to implementing incentives. So we've done it collectively in the USA, in Europe, and in Japan 20 years ago in the orphan drug business. All of those countries have validated pull incentives especially. And we're at that stage currently in the antimicrobial resistance field in terms of innovation, support stimulating innovation. So within BEAM in the last 2 years, we've been working all together with SMEs with very limited resources because definitely we don't have policy affairs or public affairs people within our company. We don't have, we're about 10 employees and with a lot of work to conduct. But we've managed to publish a position paper that I invite you to have a look at on our website. And to wrap up this introduction, a few of those measures and recommendations that we see today to support the development of innovative products through SME work and biotech work are the following. First of all, we believe that you have to keep in mind that today for infectious disease, not only you have to find new antibiotics to tackle resistant infections, but you have to handle infections differently. We talk a lot about diagnostics, which makes a lot of sense. It goes towards personalized approaches, and we have to keep in mind prevention And we are the only companies, the small companies are today the only companies developing what we call alternative to antibiotics. If you look at people working on phages in the private sector, it's only small companies. There's no, from my knowledge, there's no current effort from big companies there. So those alternatives to antibiotics are interesting because you should decrease the resistance development. So keep in mind that it's not only a question of new antibiotics. We have to handle things on various ways. The first recommendation that we made is pretty simple. It's towards Lynn, and she knows this. We've been discussing about this for some years now. We've had actually limited support from, at this stage, from EU fundings as SMEs in our programs. There has been one call in 2012. Some of us, a limited number of companies, are part of the IMI type support, but the IMI is per principle focused on big pharma type support. So there is no dedicated support under the push incentive style in Europe, and so we would be very happy in the new framework ideas that were mentioned in the introduction this morning, that you think of developing AMR product innovation around like SME instruments, which are very excellent tools for SMEs, based on the EU RTD group in type of support. So that's one key aspect. A second proposal on the push and pull, like a little bit in between, is to develop more risk-sharing tools, and there has been a very good initiative from the European Commission and the RTD group 3 years, I would say, ago now, which was to launch InnoFin. InnoFin is a loan organization with EIB, the European Investment Bank, and I think 6 or 7 projects has benefited from InnoFin at this stage, but it's only very late stage. At InnoFin, you need to have products less than 4 years on the market, and very little number of SMEs are so close to market in the drugs field. So we'd like to find ways, creative ways, to have additional supports, risk-sharing supports a little bit before. So we're highly motivated to discuss again with RTD and try to be creative in finding ways. The third topic is, and this is more on the DG Santé part, it's really trying to imagine having special regimen for those innovative products tackling AMR. Martin Seychelles mentioned that this morning in the introduction as well, so that's an additional idea. And a very interesting topic to try to push forward is all the HTAs, the health technology assessment work, all the part which will be about valuing new antibiotics, valuing alternatives to antibiotics. In Europe, we have an issue there. HTAs are national. Health systems are national, and they don't communicate too much. And being part of those groups, I'm the one letting us, informing France of what's going on in Germany and the UK and Sweden. So we have to try to communicate more and try to find ways with the European Commission to better talk to European countries in terms of pricing, valuing all those products, as well, of course, as market entry reward. Supporting education and academic research is very important. I mean, half of the SMEs that I'm representing today come from academic research. We're all spin-offs. Okay, I'm done with that. Done my minute. Thank you very much. It was a long introduction. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much. That was very interesting. Also, I note your recommendations for DG Santé and also for the next multi-annual framework program. And yes, as many of us are very busy discussing the details of the next multi-annual financial framework, your comments come exactly at the right time, I would say. I just wanted to say you certainly will have questions, but please save your questions until all the 3 panelists have actually made their comment. So I give now the floor to Professor Claude Müller, who is the head of the Infectious Disease Unit of the Luxembourgish Institute of Health.
Yes, thank you very much. So I'm from the Luxembourg Institute of Health, and we are also a WHO Regional Reference Center for Europe and the WHO Collaborative Center, and we work on different ways on different aspects of vaccines and vaccine-preventable diseases, such as vaccine immunogenicity studies. We do ad hoc sentinel sites in Laos, for instance. But in Luxembourg, we are also working on the development of new vaccination strategies. And as a partner of the FluteCore consortium, we worked on universal influenza candidate vaccine. FluteCore is one of 5 FP7 funded consortia that received 25 million altogether. There are 25 public health and academic institutes involved in these different consortia, 17 companies, 18 countries. And the research goes really from proof of concept to clinical phase 2 studies. There's a broad range of vaccine concepts that are involved in these studies, from peptides, recombinant proteins, viral vectors, and so forth. And along with these studies, there's of course also humoral and cellular immunities that are investigated, and some of these studies have led to some interesting correlates of protection for cellular immunity. This is only one example of a whole toolbox of standardized tools and assays that have been developed, including some clinical trial networks that actually turned out to be much less expensive than some of other clinical trial networks as they are in the States or performed by big pharma. So these consortia have overall been extremely successful. For instance, there's at least one product that has received a 20 million euro grant from the European Investment Bank and is moving forward. But there are many other products in the pipeline from these consortia. And the feeling is that there are not enough European public funding schemes to preserve all the knowledge that has been developed. And so as a result, the consortia have had meetings with various other players, also in the United States, with BARDA, for instance, and they were actually very interested in picking up the cherries from these projects. And I think this is perhaps a bit of a warning, I should say, for the European situation, the European funding situation, because I think we need to ask the question, do we have enough funding schemes for projects that are at different levels of development? There's of course big pharma, but you know, when you talk about vaccines, universal flu vaccines, you can imagine that big pharma is not necessarily interested in picking up those vaccines that would perhaps displace or replace seasonal vaccines that you need to distribute every year, and which is of course a big business, actually 6 billion per year. So I think that there are perhaps not enough funding opportunities in Europe to preserve these what we have achieved in these basic projects. And when I look at one of the slides that was shown here also, for Ebola, it looked like EMI was very much at the beginning of this pipeline, and then there were a lot of FDA, NIH, and BARDA money came in. Maybe I didn't interpret it properly, but that was the impression that I had. So I think we need to establish a collaborative platform in Europe with a portfolio management approach for head-to-head comparison to select the best vaccine candidates, and this, I think, should be publicly funded. Now, as a WHO Regional Reference Center, we are confronted with measles and rubella, and I think in order for all the vaccines to really become successful, it is important to overcome vaccine hesitancy. I noticed that there's a special session on this, but nevertheless, I want to say a couple of words from my own experience, because we are now in the situation that a lot of the anti-vaccine movements are moving towards countries where there's a lot of a lack of confidence in the governments, such as the Ukraine or Macedonia. I just returned from a WHO mission from Macedonia, where we have 40 to 60% vaccine coverage for MMR. I think that's much too low, of course, and so we have been discussing to introduce curricula for doctors and healthcare workers, because they are some of the obstacles in this. Yes, 1 minute, okay. So I come to my last point, and that is what I mentioned already this morning. I think it's a very, very important point, even if it doesn't totally fit into this. And I just want to say that the brain drain is a terrible problem, because we can do we can develop any vaccines that we want. We can develop the most fantastic tools, but we don't have the human resources on site. We will not be able to succeed. So, for instance, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea have only 0.1 physician per 1,000 citizens, and as I said before, they lose 50% of their skilled workers and doctors to countries that have 20 times more doctors. And this is not something that's given, but it's something that the countries do a lot of to attract, actually, these doctors and lure them away from the... So, for instance, Malawi, there are more Malawi-trained doctors in Manchester than in Malawi alone. Yeah. So I think I could give you a lot of other examples like that, but I think I'll leave it at that, and if there are more questions, I will be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Müller. So the last panelist is Dr. Markus Hess of Altona Diagnostics. You have the floor.
Yes, thank you. And also thank you for inviting me to talk a little bit about what is needed for us as a commercial company to develop suitable and reliable diagnostic assays and to make them commercially available. And I really highly appreciate the talk of Mr. Van Hoff, because most of the topics he mentioned for vaccine development and making it commercially available also count for diagnostic assays and tools. So as I only have 5 minutes, I can save some time, because I totally agree with all he said. So nobody knows what will be the next cause of the next epidemic outbreak. It might be something known and expected, like a new influenza genotype. It might be something known to be able to cause outbreaks, like Ebola virus, but occurring in a totally unexpected geographic region, like the Ebola outbreak in Western Africa. Or it might be something new and unexpected, like the SARS coronavirus or the Zika virus outbreak. Therefore, in order to be prepared for the next big outbreak, what we need a broad diagnostic tool for surveillance and early diagnosis of suspicious cases. Broad diagnostic tools means that we need what is called, and what was also mentioned a couple of times today, syndronic panels for different diagnostics, like fever panels, diarrhea panels, encephalitis panels, and so on. But we also need panels that cover certain virus families, like filovirus panels, coronavirus panels, or arbovirus panels. And here I'm not talking necessarily about multiplex panels. Again, I have only 5 minutes, and it would take way more time to explain why I really don't believe in these multiplex panels, but there are other solutions out there. But these panels, what they should contain are assays to test for different pathogens causing the same syndromes or belonging to the same virus family. The idea behind that is that a patient sample can get analyzed depending on the clinical signs for different pathogens. And after the causative pathogen of a potential outbreak has been identified, pathogen-specific assays can be used for confirmation and/or higher throughput testing. Either as they're already developed and available, or sometimes it's necessary to optimize them depending on the sequence of the new genotype which got detected. These assays, as they are today, or these panels, they are usually designed to be used in central laboratory settings with appropriate infrastructure and trained personnel, like bigger hospitals, reference labs, mobile labs. The problem is that it might take days to transport a sample from a regional hospital to a reference lab and get it analyzed and get the result back to the physicians or the doctors in the regional hospital. Therefore, what is also needed are mobile diagnostic tools for early point of care or point of need, depending on the definition, diagnosis. These systems should be placed in regional hospitals and be used for surveillance in rural regions. But the challenge is, and a lot of people forget about that, is that these point of care, point of need systems, that the results you get out of them, they need to be as reliable as the results you get with assays performed in central laboratory settings. Because there's no benefit in having a fast assay, a point of care assay, whatsoever, if the positive or the predictive diagnostic value is very low. So there's nothing you can do with these results. So the real challenge is, yes, I believe we need mobile diagnostic tools, but they have to be highly reliable. So what do we need as a small diagnostic company if we want to develop such assays and to make them commercially available? One of the most important points is that we need close collaboration with experts and reference labs to get an idea of how the assay should look like and what specifications are needed to be fulfilled by these assays. Second, and this is in many cases the most challenging topic, we need access to quantified sample material and sequence information for development, but also for verification of the assays. After that, we need collaborations with labs and reference centers with access to real patient material to perform the validation studies. For some of these assays, the validation studies, they have to be performed in BSL-4 labs. And we need a realistic and a standardized protocol to get these assays approved. In particular, if there is no emergency use authorization program in place for the specific pathogen. And last but not least, we are a commercial company. So these diagnostic tools, the assays, the panels, the point-of-care systems, they need to be developed, verified, validated, approved, produced and quality controlled, and maintained. So what we really need is any kind of a business model to make that happen. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much indeed, and also for your last comments on the business model. My impression is that also, let's say, the governance of health systems also needs a new business model to create the right framework for these kind of innovative business models. So you heard the three panelists with their short interventions. Do you have any questions? Let's start the debate. Who would like to ask a question or has a comment? Yes, please.
Just they need to come to the microphone.
Ah, yes, you need to go to the microphone, grab the microphone and ask your question.
Yes,
Okay, maybe I can start. I'm Klaus Zichutek from the Paul-Ehrlich Institute in Germany, regulating vaccines and biomedicines. I have three interventions, two to Dr. Van Hoff. A very inspiring talk. I was wondering, there are institutions and committees, for example, at the WHO, that prioritize current vaccine developments under the category what's going to come next in terms of epidemics? And number two, what are the chances to be successful? I was wondering how much interest of industry is concerning that. And there's a second part actually of WHO, which we interact with, and we develop preferred product characteristics. I was wondering how helpful that is really to industry. And then the next question is concerning vaccine platforms. I think that's the thrill of the day, that we all believe that vaccine platforms could be helpful to prepare for more than one epidemic. I was wondering how much IP and other patent infringements could block the interaction of industry towards developing these things together. And then maybe a general remark, listening to all these things from the audience. I have the feeling there's very good funding from all kinds of sources. They are great projects, but I was wondering who has the overview, who's wondering about overlaps, and who's looking at sustainability, because these things need to lead to structures rather than projects. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. If you would like to answer.
First of all, thank you for a very interesting question. I'll make an attempt to answer to them, although I'm not sure I have the 100% answer here. Yes, indeed, there has been a lot of discussions around which pathogens to prioritize, and there actually WHO started that discussion already a few years ago. They came up with a list that actually is on their website. Actually, also, I know Finland also has published such a list from their perspective. And the Coalition of Epidemic Preparedness actually has a scientific advisory board, which actually was tasked to define, okay, based on all of this, what are the likely viruses to come along? And Lassa is one of them, Nipah and MERS is one of them. The challenges will they be the right ones or no, but certainly I think that from an industry perspective, we are looking to WHO and CEPI and others to help prioritizing, and we are in sync with those ones. The big challenge is indeed to be prepared for the unknown, and that is indeed where platforms come in. I think that in general, I'm a strong believer in platform. It all depends on what the definition is, what do you call a platform, and what do you expect from a platform. The platform that I'm referring to, which is essentially a proprietary cell line which can be grown at very high cell density, combined with adenovectors that actually have, which is the backbone and which we insert a transgene depending on the vaccine we want to develop, I consider the platform. Why? Indeed, we have a lot of plug and play, and we do see that we have a lot of learnings across the different projects. We see systematically the same reactogenicity profile and so on, and that has allowed us to build also confidence with the authorities that indeed the reactogenicity and safety of this platform is driven by the backbone, and that just changing that transgene will not make the difference. And that allows you really to go that much faster. And that is what I've tried to illustrate using the Zika example, where we, between the ID and the first in human, we had less than one year. Now, this being said, I'm very proud of having less than 1 year. And then I'm told by others, but that's far too long, we want a few weeks. And that's where the current hope is, could RNA vaccine be that next generation? And I think the judge is still out. We are ourselves working with some companies looking to RNA as platform. I think they are promising, but they certainly have their limitations. And I hope we are not in the same situation today as we were at the hype of the DNA vaccines in the 90s. But again, I think platform is important, and a part of the solution is indeed platform. And to illustrate that thinking, it's also CEPI, which actually, stimulated by the Gates Foundation and others, has actually issued now a call for proposal on validating some of these platforms. Thank you. IP. Yeah. So with regard to patent interference, yes, we have concerns about how to make sure that we protect know-how, because for vaccines it's even more know-how than patents. With regard to how to make sure that this does not leak back to commercial applications. However, this does not mean that we do not want to make these platforms available for these targets. So for not-for-profit targets, and now I can only talk for our company, but I know that colleagues from other companies think very similarly, we have no problem whatsoever to make that technology available for these platforms. But at the same time, there is a challenge. And the challenge is, how do you secure the fact that this know-how will not leak back and over into other potentially commercial applications? And that is, for instance, where sometimes when we would be asked to say mandatory tech transfer, where we say, well, that might be one bridge too far. It all depends on whom you are transferring it to. What I want to avoid is that we see that 2 years later, there is an RSV vaccine coming up by that partner who actually uses your cell line and your technology for a commercial vaccine. But I'm convinced, and we have examples, that you can secure that problem and that it should not be a blocking factor.
I just want to comment on your last question, Klaus, on the funding. Now, I don't know if you referred specifically to the funding of the Ebola vaccine, where indeed the Commission has put a lot of money via the IMI. But at least I can guarantee that we are looking carefully into what we are funding and also coordinating with BARDA to make sure that we don't pay twice for the same thing. But it is true that we have... Yeah, and I think as Johan rightly said also, is who in the long term will fund the stockpiling and also be ready indeed to move into phase 3 and so on. So many things still need to be solved. Huh? So I think there were, yes, please.
Yes, hello, thank you. Lawrence Marzal from CoU. It's really an observation for Dr. Van Hoof from I guess, a different perspective. I'm working in another H2020 called Unity, which is around community policing across 8 European countries. And I was quite struck in your presentation where you were talking about the collaboration and the understanding of all of those stakeholders involved and their roles, responsibilities, the capabilities and the capacities of those organizations. And in community policing, communities are very much ecosystems. And in Unity, we're capturing and structuring and unifying all of those multiple different stakeholders to understand from a governance perspective, governance through to operational delivery of community policing on the ground. And it just struck me how similar the structural challenges and the structural issues of decision-making, because ultimately decision-making is about information, where that information comes from, and using it to make informed and better informed decisions. And it just struck me that there may be quite a lot of overlap and sharing of knowledge between other H2020 projects where we're tackling those issues which could assist in some of the things that you pointed out. So an observation, really.
Yeah, I think it's a very fair point, but I really felt it was important to stress on how, in face of that crisis, everyone joined efforts, and at that moment it didn't matter that much what label we had on our business card. And that was really, I'm 30 years in the business, it's the first time I've witnessed, well, to that extent, I'm not saying that we were fighting before, but it's the first time that I've seen that solidarity that really came to how can we efficiently work together. It's also, with the waning epidemic, that waned a little bit as well.
Sure. Sorry, just one more point on that. And it's very much a governance issue. And when those organizations come together, if they're, from their perspective as individual organizations, whether they're public or private or voluntary, if their governance, if they haven't stepped back to understand a shared approach, shared risk, and a set of shared outcomes, it's very difficult for that interoperability to take place.
It's a good point. Governance is one of the challenges, because in these meetings, as this is supranational, but there's no one really who has authority over the others, so that's where it almost has to be done by consensus. And that's where we know that in general, it might be challenging, but it was striking to see how the pressure of the crisis itself actually created an automatic authority to WHO to almost say what needs to be done, even if there's no written laws about, hey, they are the boss here. And that was interesting dynamics.
Yes, if only we would know how to repeat this dynamic if there's no crisis.
Yes.
Yes. Are there further questions? Yes, please.
The title of your panel is Filling the Medical Countermeasures Pipeline, but as we know, that pipeline narrows down to a soda straw. And if we want something to come out of the end of the pipeline, we've got to negotiate that. Johan, your slide on the pathway there, you have the phase 3 outbreak opportunity there. And we know what happened with Ebola is that, that opportunity, more or less, Merck got to capitalize on it and you didn't, and now you're negotiating that awkward pathway with the animal rule. So what happens next time? Pathogen X comes along and somebody's trying to get you to do this all over again. What kind of assurances do you need to have about access to that opportunity or some way around it to want to do this all over again? Or is your lesson from that you will never do this all over again?
It certainly is not the last one. I think that there is no easy answer to your question. And I think that is why it's so important that we work on preparedness. It's so important why we are working, CEPI for instance, but also others on, let's try to have stockpiles for the most likely pathogens to occur, such that when that outbreak is there, we can really roll them out and do that effectiveness study. But your question is still valid. What about the unknown pathogen? Yeah.
And who gets that opportunity if there's more than one player?
Well, and from an industry perspective, I'm not so certain that I care that much about who gets that opportunity. I'm more interested in, let's make sure that we don't have the disaster again. And then I do think that there should be some governance, and it should not be the company, that actually has a discussion around, based on everything we know to date, whether it relates to the human immunogenicity, to the safety profile, to the kinetics of the immune responses, to what you see in animals, and then make a sound judgment on which candidates are likely effective here. And then I actually do think that I was thinking about the adaptive approach this morning. I think it might be very well justifiable to make a multi-pronged approach where you actually are testing several vaccines next to each other. Because if there is a real pandemic, one single company will never be able to deliver the vaccine in time. So I think the world should benefit and would benefit from having several candidates.
Thank you. And further questions? Ah, yes.
Jean-Louis Romet from the European Virus Archive. It's a question for the big pharma. What about antiviral drugs? Because you are talking about vaccine. Even with the best vaccine, you will need 3 weeks to immunize a population, even if you have all the doses in hand, right? And so what will happen during those 3 weeks? Catastrophe, a catastrophe thing. So you have to think also about antiviral drugs. And nobody is talking about that. I'm surprised.
Actually, I happen to be, it's only the last 4 years I'm focusing on vaccines. I'm also was in charge of the antivirals. I didn't talk about it today. We actually have been screening very intensively during the crisis, and we should have done that before, on what is potential antiviral activity of what we have in-house. And there were many of them, and that effort is still ongoing. I think that also there we say, finish the job like we do for the vaccine. But the challenge there was indeed reaching the patients in time and setting up the clinical trials. So there was a huge handicap in getting the socialized, but it's a very valid point. And I can tell you that there are quite some initiatives looking at those antivirals. There was also a lot of talk about hyperimmune serum from survivors to test it. And I think it was the Tropical Institute in Antwerp here that was driving that. So there have been, the challenge is how can we test it in humans?
Yeah, actually we have a good, I agree with you. We have a good experience with chikungunya in La Réunion. We had actually a good anti-flu drugs, which was active also on chikungunya. But we didn't have the cohort because at the time, we were testing the drug on human. Actually, the number of patients disappeared. We had nobody to test anymore. Yeah. And so instead of rediscovering the wheel, I'm sure in your chemotech, you have many drugs which could be tested and already approved for different indication. But it can be tested as an antiviral drugs. And nobody actually is doing this type of attempt to, on animal test, on animal trial, test those drugs.
I have to respectfully to disagree. I'm aware of a lot of experiments being done and screenings done specifically on this. Yep.
Thank you. The next question, please. Or the next comment, or the next suggestion from the floor.
I just want to make one comment with regard to the slide that I've shown. It relates to a comment that you made. I actually have indicated the arrows where the contracts started. So still today in phase 3, we have IMI money that is being spent. So it's only the start of the contract, it's not the running of the contract. And that might, perception-wise, indeed create a perception that everything was in the beginning. No, that's not the case.
Yes, thank you. Maybe one of the 3 other panelists has a comment on any of those questions which have been asked or comments which were made. No, that's not the case. Further comments from the floor, further questions from the floor? Yes.
François Boileau, I am a consultant to DG DevCo. DG DevCo is the directorate at the commission that is in charge of development and cooperation. And actually, I was tempted to say that I've not a question, but more of a comment, because what I can hear from most of the comments in this morning session and this afternoon session are calls for integration of research from a user point of view and the user that is in the South. And that seemingly the big absent today in this meeting as a stakeholder in all these preparedness and resilience building is the side of the users in the southern countries. And this is a huge challenge to develop, in particular because there are conflicting interests. At the moment, we are working at the same time on building up health security, but also responding to the global gag rule from the US government. And for that, of course, money is not expandable. There is a limited volume, and we have to find solutions that are efficient. And I would want to call from the research community to give us, who are working in the South, solutions that we can actually implement with the human resources that you, Mr. Muller, mentioned, because we have no more arms to deliver. And that is the critical bottleneck. And second, that also this community of researchers keeps advocating for being aware that health security in the South is also our concern here in Europe. So the users, we have been hearing a lot the outcomes in terms of growth, and this is a concern of the Commission. But security is also one and very high on the agenda, and health security clearly is. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Does any of you have a comment on this? Yes.
I think your question is very well taken, and I think it's a great problem that if we do not develop at the same time the tool and the human resources, where the tools are going to be used most, we are going to fail. And so it's not about, parachuting into a site where we have an outbreak, whatever kind of outbreak it is. It's all about strengthening the curative health system, the routine health system, the routine vaccination, in order to make the surveillance sustainable in the country with the resources of the country. I mean, I give you an example that we have, that we always discuss in relation to measles and the measles elimination. Of course, it's possible to immunize by supplementary immunization activities large parts of the population, and then have and have no cases for the next few years until it starts up again. But I believe that it is important that this is not, from my point of view, that's not the way to go. The way to go is to strengthen the routine vaccinations so that the country and the system benefits from the elimination effort. And it's not an NGO that finds it very sexy to come in and vaccinate 2 million kids or people of the population. So I think we need to take the country along, and we need to implement things and tools that are actually at the level of the country. And this can be very tedious, but from my own experience, we've been teaching and training individuals from developing countries for the past 25 years. And we've always made sure that we afterwards followed up and that we actually provided the little support that is necessary to stabilize their situation and have them move along in their system and in their institution. So I think, and this is not very expensive, but it means it's a long-term engagement that you have to take. So I think it's a different way of thinking. It's a thinking in terms of years and not in terms of quickly in and quickly out.
Yes, thank you very much. That's the end of the session now. We have now 10 minutes of coffee break. I thank the audience and I thank the panelists for your interesting interventions. Yes, and I think we had an interesting discussion. So it will continue at...
Yes, in 10 minutes. Because we have absolutely to finish at 5 o'clock. So that's the only constraints we have, because there's then the cocktail and so on. So I have tough instructions of getting the things done by 5 o'clock. So I'm now pleased to introduce our last keynote speaker, Dr. Heidi Larsson from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, who will speak about ensuring vaccination uptake from hesitancy to supply. So, Heidi, the floor is yours.
Somebody has a, usually it's height, but now, well, that's clear. Who is it? Doesn't seem to be. Well, while we're getting a battery, I guess, maybe. Oops. Sorry. Well, I'll not waste time while the pictures are being sorted out. Oh, okay, great. Great. Okay, thanks. Well, in the context of the talks today, and I appreciate all of them, and I've picked up on a few points, and I think the first one from the opening this morning is really to talk about, just to say a couple, say a couple words about our group, the Vaccine Confidence Project, which, as we heard this morning, the importance of linking research with public health, with politics, and with policy. And at the Vaccine Confidence Project, which I lead at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, we really focus on gathering research, monitoring issues around public trust in vaccines, and issues around acceptance in real time, trying to give rapid feedback, analyzing it, and creating evidence for action. So we've heard a number of issues this morning about outbreaks, and we just heard Johan's presentation about Ebola, which I work very closely with. I lead the community engagement, deployment, acceptance, and compliance around the Ebola trials that he was referring to. It's a big IMI consortium, and it's been a very exciting and challenging time. But, you know, here we have something like Ebola, like Zika, which is another project we're working on, initiative we're working on. Sometimes we need a vaccine and we don't have one, and sometimes we have a vaccine and people refuse to use it. And this is the case we have in Europe. I'm sure that most of you have been reading the news about the extent of the outbreaks, and the news keeps repeating the 35 people dying, but I think it's up to 49. Germany, so there's panicked over measles, and then it says Google parents shun measles vaccines. So we have this paradox going on, and I've mentioned it in discussions even with Johan around CEPI. Let's make sure that we pay attention to building confidence in these vaccines from the beginning, and that's one reason our group is getting increasingly involved in engagement, building trust and confidence from the beginning with trials and not waiting for delivery. And then we have the case of H1N1. That was another, from a public confidence point of view, fiasco. And it wasn't just the public, it was health professionals, and that's becoming a real concern because any study right now that I've seen will continue to say the most trusted in a world of eroding trust in just about everybody, every institution from, well, I won't start the list, but your health provider still is the one that holds some trust. So when we see that happening, it's a concern. So as I mentioned, this is our research group, is called the Vaccine Confidence Project, and we talk about, it's called Vaccine Confidence. Sometimes we think we should just call it the Confidence Project because we're seeing how much links there are between public trust in vaccines and confidence in the providers. I don't like the provider. I don't have a problem with the vaccine, but I'm not going back to that person, or they don't treat me nicely in the clinic, so I don't want to go there. It's not my problem. I don't have a problem with the vaccine, but I'm not going back to that clinic. They don't treat me well. And confidence in policymakers and systems. And actually, governments. This last one is really about governments. And public distrust in government is a big underlying challenge across our research. What we really are trying to do, and for 5 years, I was the global director of UNICEF's immunization communication, and that's when I started to see, and we were just getting involved with the launch of Gavi and getting the introduction of new vaccines off the ground. And instead of focusing on strategy for introduction of vaccines, which is why I was brought on board for this role, I ended up getting the nickname the director of UNICEF's fire department because we had an epidemic of breakdowns in public trust and confidence around the world. And I realized that we needed to understand this better than doing fix-it all the time. So, but the other thing I realized in trying to talk to colleagues in the health division, in the immunization program, it was, it's anecdotal, it's messy, it's not fact, and that's all true. But I realized what was missing is metrics. Until we systematically measure, monitor, and come up with a way to understand and look at it over time, we're never gonna conquer this growing challenge. So if there's one mission we have at the Confidence Project, is to measure, monitor, compare, and look at the spread over time and over place. We launched our first State of Vaccine Confidence report in 2015. It was an in-depth look at 5 countries, but it was really a look back over the last decade, well, actually going back even earlier than that, to look at how the situation has evolved globally, what are the key issues, and basically being a benchmark report. We did another study in 2016, the State of Vaccine Confidence globally, which you might have seen in the news, because Europe was found out of our 67 countries around the world to be the most skeptical region, and France won the global prize. I think it was 41% of the country, the representative sample said they did not trust that vaccines were safe. 41%, 40, even more, 43 maybe. And that was compared to a global average of about 13. So surveillance, we talked about surveillance or heard about surveillance this morning. It's absolutely critical for all the work we're talking about. But I think there's one other piece of surveillance that is the part that we're working on, is not just about infection and intervention, but on emotion. We need to we are doing surveillance of public trust. We are doing surveillance of what are the issues that people care about. When people report an adverse event, typically The issue is investigated to see if the complaint is an organic or etiological, some connection to the vaccine itself, and if it's delinked from the vaccine, the report gets checked, not related, bottom drawer. But the questions in the population are still there, and I think one of the things we've missed is looking at these reported adverse events as a report on the perceptions of risk in the public, and turn that around, because if you look right now in a lot of the anti-vaccine or vaccine skeptical crowds, they keep in the last, particularly over the last year, looking at, there's an absolutely huge number of adverse events reported after HPV vaccine. They don't say suspected adverse events, they say reported, and that's partly our problem as a public health community and how we name it. But actually, they're right. It is a huge number. It is much bigger than any other vaccine that we've seen on record, but that doesn't mean that that's adverse event. But because of that, I say, well, that's their perception, and that's what we should worry about. We're using social media, we do survey, we do a mix of monitoring methods. We started looking at ways we could build on both Canada and ProMed and a few other initiatives 10, 15 years ago, started using online media monitoring to pick up disease outbreaks. When I set up this initiative, I said, let's model it on that, but look at early signals of rumor outbreaks. So we built on that system. We did a lot of work for quality control, looking at, does it work, does it not work, are we picking up legitimate things, and how comprehensive are we? What we learned is what is increasingly being seen in the reviews of social media and online media analysis. It does give important and useful real-time signals. Don't count on it alone. Use it, it's an important complement, but integrate it into other analytics. So we simultaneously do qualitative research surveys. We have a 24/7 system on scientific literature, and try to put the piece together. Out of our analysis of use of online media and surveillance, we picked up 1 year of our, this was about 10,500 media reports that we did content analysis, identified 33 different categories of concern. This is just the map of the positive to negative sentiment. What's interesting is that this was a slice of time for 1 year that had this map, and then last year this was the 67 country survey, which was a representative sample. It was a studied group in all these countries. This was a map produced by Le Monde. It was interesting. Science and Le Monde made their own maps of our data, which I liked this one actually, and I thought it was relevant, particularly for here with the big lens on Europe. But the map is not that different, actually. I went back and looked at this map. I mean, this one has more detail with the numbers on it, but so there are, and by looking at what are we learning from surveys, what are we learning from online media, increasingly social media, what are we learning in the scientific literature, what are people paying attention to, and then we corroborate the different information. This is not women in their knitting circles talking to each other. This is on billboards now. This is public. This is, we've hit the big time if we had something good to sell, but we don't. I mean, we do, but the perception of the product is hurting. This is a billboard in Romania. This is from Pisa in Italy about just risks and anxieties, and I saw a billboard outside of in California last year. It was a big apple, but it had a needle stuck in it, and would you eat this apple if it had, and it lists all kinds of chemical ingredients. But anyway, the point is that this is not in the background. These are things on billboards over highways and large. And so we think about, we bring very much kind of the model of viral disease transmission to the viral spread of rumors and emotion. In this, this is the not so welcoming crowd with the announcement of the compulsory legislation. And we see that these emotive, especially with the connectedness of the world and social media, how rapidly these things are spreading. So when Denmark sneezes, Japan shuts down their HPV program. It was not quite that quick, but it was amazing how the situation of the HPV reactions in Denmark was an absolutely big influence on Japanese government decision to shut down to suspend their HPV program. And this was an article we did that was tracking a lot of the memes, the repeated concerns, whether they were legitimate or not, well, and most of them weren't, but the way they spread and how they influenced policy, vaccine uptake, and consequent disease outbreaks. This is particular to HPV. So when we think, when we see the European points, they're not just a European problem, they're not just a French problem or a Danish problem. And right now, we used to think, well, you know, England had the MMR problem, France had the hepatitis B anxieties, but we, thankfully with the channel in between and they speak different languages, we're safe. But that might have been true a while ago, but, or at least to a certain extent, but right now, thanks to the connectedness and also Google Translate, which, as I was mentioning before, it's an imperfect, although getting better. So when it takes bad information or misinformation, mistranslates it, then it pops around the world. We shouldn't wonder why we have a challenge. Now, what's interesting is we've been following mostly print and written content, but one of the trends and changes, particularly in the last few years, has been a shift, and this is true in general in terms of usage of social media. The absolute number one thing, zooming to the top with social media use among adolescents, is Instagram wins the prize. Pretty much in many countries, from Japan to Europe to other places, a lot more don't bother with words, just share pictures. And YouTube is also becoming quite a big one. And movies. This was a Danish documentary that was one of the critical negative influences on the uptake of HPV vaccine, but there has been mimic behavior in different countries. Japan, this is some of these girl victims after HPV vaccination and spreading. This is, the translation says, it's now going on in 8 cities in Japan. In Colombia, there are 400 to 500 girls, actually more than 500 girls, who started these symptoms across Colombia in schools. It was unbelievable. They were literally mimicking the images on YouTube that they had found. And we've been doing an investigation on this and following it, because we think it's really important to be documenting what is the evolution of these things. How do they get triggered? How do they evolve? What are their impacts? So we can start using them. I mean, teaching and research is our main mission at the School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and most of the training is about the good things we can do and getting your method right and getting out there. And we want to bring in also, well, what happens when people don't want the good things you want to give them? And then how do you handle that and get beyond it? This is Ireland, again, different angle, but the principle is the same. And the challenge is, and this is the other part that we think is particularly important to document and monitor from a public health perspective, is this is not just chatterboxes, these are having serious public health impacts. This was what happened with the HPV uptake in Denmark. It is recovering, but in the Irish Times, there was a concern about the panic around HPV there. In Japan, as you may know, it's dropped from over 75% to under 1%. And in June this year, it'll be, I think, the 5th year since it's suspended its vaccination. And Italy also, this was, yeah, I mean, now this was before they announced their compulsory legislation, but it's having impacts. This is not just anecdotal information. And as you've seen, it comes out, and there's Italy in dark brown. I mean, as you know, Romania and Italy have had over 5,000 cases each of measles, and it's pretty serious. Oops. So what we've seen again and again in our research, because we really try to look at what are the contextual issues, because a lot of the concerns from these people are not specific to the product. It's about relationships, it's about other things that are happening around it. So we need to pull the lens back and look at the context. This is it's called the Edelman Trust Barometer. It was launched at Davos several years ago, and every year they come up with a new ranking of trust in government, in business, in media. And last year, there were a lot of European countries in the dark blue, which was distrusting, and it was. We see again and again correlations between people's distrust in vaccine and their trust or distrust in government. In the 2015 State of Vaccine Confidence Report, we also did a correlation in our survey and in our interviews. We also asked about confidence in the health services, confidence in the system. We also asked about confidence in other programs to give a bit of a context. You know, are you confident in or what's your level of confidence in immunization? And we also asked about family planning services, and we asked about maternal care to look at, well, is this a problem system-wide or is this unique to immunization? Actually, to be fair, immunization was better than most others in most countries. Nigeria, it looked like it had a 70% confidence in immunization. And having worked on the polio boycott and a number of issues in Nigeria, I thought, I think they're saying that because that's what they think they should say. Maybe they're not telling us what they really think. And then I looked at what their comments were about the family planning program, and that was a 23% confidence. So I thought, well, they probably are telling us the truth. And then when we looked at it at a state level, the North, where there was the boycott of the polio program, that had a much higher discontent in the program. So in these bigger country surveys, you really need to get to state level to understand the dynamics. But what we found overall across all these four countries, India, Pakistan, Nigeria, and the UK, that in all countries where there was higher confidence in the health system, there was lower hesitancy. So, because a lot of people talk about that, but I really couldn't find data to reinforce that. But we got numbers to confirm that. Our Vaccine Confidence Index, the 67 country study, you can go to our website and click on any of the 67 countries and see the data and see the answers. And when you click on the bars there, the actual numbers come up, and we will be rerunning a number of different countries, hopefully Europe again this year, and a number of countries have used it as a benchmark. The Philippines, since they had a kind of panic about the risks of the dengue vaccine, that has spread to distrust of the immunization system. They've had reduction in measles uptake and measles outbreaks. So the Philippines has said, we remember your study last year. Can you come and run the questions again this year? Because we think this anxiety about the dengue vaccine is spreading to our wider confidence. We want to see the difference. So, and we've had that from a number of countries, and also here, we'll do it here again in Europe. In 2013, WHO recognized that this was getting to be a bigger and bigger problem, mostly because a lot of their member states were coming to them saying, help. So SAGE, the Strategic Advisory Group of Experts, convened a working group on vaccine hesitancy, and I was on it with I think there were about 10 of us. And the ask was to do an assessment of what are the determinants, are there any good strategies, and basically to give some recommendations. Since we had already been working on this in our research group, we led a number of the reviews to assess the issues. And in our determinants of vaccine hesitancy paper, we clustered the key determinants under vaccine and vaccine-specific issues, whether it was the vaccine itself, the adjuvants, the schedule. If that was the issue, it was there. The next group of influences were beliefs, personal experiences, risks, kind of local social influences, and then the other was contextual influences, distrust in government, it's religious, a religious reason, there was a historical problem. In Europe, we've done quite a bit of work with ECDC. We did a study on vaccine hesitancy and on health workers' experiences, both qualitative and lit review. Side effects is consistently, safety is a really big concern, and sometimes it's guised as other things. I think we need to do a better job of communicating the rigorous safety process that goes on. I'm going to fly through the rest here. So it's health professionals, as I said. We did a review with health professionals. One of the things, the only thing I'd want to stress here is what all the health professionals said was, I need to feel more supported by colleagues and by the outside, because I'm getting a lot of negative pressure around me, and somehow I need a support group. It's like Alcoholics Anonymous, or, you know, help me out here. I feel more and more alone with the number of questions I'm being faced with. This is just the IMI project that I mentioned before, EBODEC. You know, I spend half my time about Sierra Leone and thinking about what's going on there, but so many times some of the key issues that we're coming up with there are very relevant to the rest of the world and these issues. We have a rapid social science team that gives daily feedback to the clinical team. We've written a paper on the issues called Power, Fairness, and Trust, and that could absolutely be the title of a paper on the situation in Europe. Power dynamics, fairness, are you being fair, and do I trust? Again and again, that came up in different ways, and I would honestly say it's in a lot of places. I love this quote from the head of MSF in Guinea. At the end of Ebola, he said, when I look back, instead of asking for more beds, we should have asked for more sensitization. In Guinea, the emotions were so strong, you probably read that there were some health workers actually killed. The other IMI consortium that I'm leading on the communication for is the Advanced Consortium. That's about risk and benefit. We just wrote up some of our major findings, and we called the title of the report Benefit of the Doubt, or Doubts Over the Benefits. And I think that that's an important mantra. There's a limit to how much information, and actually if people have suspicions, we need to focus on. I think we understate and under-address emotions in the context of this area. These are some of the reports we did for ECDC. You can just Google ECDC and vaccine hesitancy. This is not what we should be doing in our communications. This was during the H1N1 saga. This was on a cover. I saw, this was from the US. and it was kind of I think someone parodying it. But when I landed in the UK, when I started there, it was around the same time, and there was 100,000 Londoners to die of pig flu was the Evening Standard. I thought, oh, what have I come to? Anyway, that's wrapping it up. I did a piece last week in Financial Times about the measles, and it's again about how much, to turn this picture around, we need to build social trust in general. And that's it. This is our website. We have constantly renewing the media, the literature, and commentaries. Sorry, oh, you don't need this.
So thank you very much for a very interesting and I think quite unique speech, because I think you're one of the few people who actually are actively working in this area of more the social sciences. So Heidi, unfortunately, need to leave before we finish the panel, so I will allow for 1 or 2 questions, if you have any, to Heidi, before we move to the panel. Yes, please come to the microphone.
Hello, Dr. Larson. Very interesting. And again, it's another comment, observation. And not to trivialize it at all, but my background's advertising. And it's very interesting that in various sort of global brands, you have to have a good brand. And that good brand is emotional. And it's about, you know, the heart, but it has to be supported by rational and logical attributes of the product. And it strikes me you have a similar problem. Whereas you have the rational and the logical attributes of the vaccines and what they are, what they do, versus the emotional brand. And you have to get the two in balance. And you have to make them work together to win that social trust. So just to simplify it, this is about branding and then how you communicate it.
Yeah, we need to work on our brand. We've taken it for granted for too long, that's for sure.
Yeah, exactly. But the whole social content,
yeah,
you know, trust is about making sure that people buy it logically on the logical attributes, but then their heart, you know, has got to buy the emotional side.
Can't argue with that.
One more question.
Yes, Peter Dell with Gates Foundation. I guess, could you just comment a little more, I guess, on the trend lines of what you're seeing, and the other angle is, again, on the developing world setting and how this is spilling over. There was that one line from Japan to Kenya, or how much more of that are you seeing as we're rolling out vaccines in the developing world?
Unfortunately, we're seeing a lot more of it, and in some ways, and it's particularly in urban areas, which are more kind of social media saturated. Like last year, we had there was a measles rubella campaign, and you've probably heard, in South India, which is typically the highest vaccinating part of India, and it was disrupted, not in the Silicon Valley positive sense, but in the public health negative sense, by a Facebook and WhatsApp campaigns. It was a mix of autism myths, religion. It was a lot of different things. But the medium around the world is just, because of social media, in places where they don't even have alternative information, they can get that. So it's localized, but it doesn't end with that. It's not social media to social media. One villager gets it somewhere, and they, go through what we called the coconut wireless in their traditional communication. And but I think it's not. We can handle it, but we just need to be much more on the ball and aware of it, and not think of it as fringe, and get ahead of the curve.
So one quick question, and then I will ask at the same time the panel to join the table. So, Claude.
Yeah, I was just going to ask your opinion about this. I'm teaching a class for medical students on vaccine hesitancy, And we tend to differentiate between those that are just complacent, vaccine complacency, then those that are actually conscientious objectors. So they are happy if they don't get vaccinated, but they don't proselyte, so they don't try to convince others. And then the militant anti-vaccine community, who really try to get others not to become vaccinated. And from a practical point of view, as a practitioner, as a medical doctor, I think it helps to decide whom you are talking to. Is it just somebody who doesn't feel like, oh, not today, maybe tomorrow? Or is it somebody who's just, in his cocon and he doesn't want to be vaccinated but doesn't care about the others? And then the third ones that want to, convince the rest of the world of stopping vaccination. Would you see that?
In a nutshell, I think if there was a continuum from the extreme kind of propaganda side, pro-vaccine, to the extreme anti-side, I think in the middle, overall, we still have maybe about 80% that are still accepting vaccines, and it obviously varies by the vaccine. But I think that's where we need to go, is the people who are increasingly questioning, and we cannot shut down questioning. I think there was a mistake in a recent WHO statement that said we have to prevent vaccine hesitancy. Hesitancy and healthy, responsible questioning is the right, and I think the responsibility of young mothers. So we have to be really careful in saying that we don't want to shut down responsible questioning, because that's part of the reason we're in the problem we are. But I do think that talking to the people who are still open to a conversation, building their confidence, making them more resilient to the ones who are aggressive and trying to change their minds in a negative way. And I think by mapping it, it's really important the way you're doing it. I can send you some things too that are ways that.
Yes, please do that.
Okay, thanks.
So thanks a lot, Heidi. And so we now move to the last panel, which will be co-chaired by Isabel de la Mata. And I hand over to you, Isabel, to start introducing the panel.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Line. I'm Isabel de la Mata from DG Sante in the European Commission, and I'm going to chair this last panel about vaccination. As you maybe know, the Commission has an initiative for strengthening the cooperation against vaccine-preventable diseases, because we have a problem. We have the problem that diseases that could have been eliminated long ago, and some of the targets of WHO was, for example, for measles, was eliminating measles from the European region in 2000, and as has been presented, we had huge outbreaks and even 50 deaths last year. Maybe we can think that 50 deaths is nothing compared with 500 million of inhabitants in the European Union, but 50 deaths easily preventable. So to give the insight on the work that they are doing, we are going to have first short statements by our 4 panelists. So at the beginning will be 5 minutes just to explain what you are doing, your institutions are doing on working on hesitancy to increase the vaccine coverage, that at the end is the objective. So first we have Christine Montineri-Berlin from the Ministry of Health in France. Please, you have it.
So first, thank you to Heidi, actually, for describing the situation in France. I know now, I know why I was invited to talk. So yeah, I just wanted to briefly, touch about the current situation in France and how, we try, to improve it. So you've learned, vaccine coverage is uneven. We have 96% of people, vaccinated for diphtheria, tetanus, and polio, but only 24, for HPV. There's a growing concern about, so we have a growing concern about vaccine uptake, and so we have decided a set of measures, and that I will go quickly through. You have to know that vaccine costs are not an issue in France, because it's covered 100% by national and private insurance. So vaccine access as well. So since November last year, measles outbreak, we have had about, 400 cases, 1 death, and people can't believe that you still can die, from measles. Even educated people, and it's frightening when you're talking to the people, because they can't believe, because you have hospital at hand and care at hand. So vaccine is... in the media, there have been this growing concerns on vaccine safety. We see a lot of communication adverse effect or possible adverse effect. And the media are very silent about the problem, the deaths, and the people who could have lived, if vaccinated. And still high in social and territorial inequality in health, but strangely, it's not the social. For example, we have had, a study in France and discovered that the people from low social environment were more vaccinated on HPV than more educated people. So it was interesting. At least social deprivation doesn't work the way we could think it could work. So a comprehensive set of new measures decided by Minister Buzyn to improve immunization. And this, the measures, immunization measures are included into a whole set of prevention measures. So it's not isolated. We started with extended, mandatory immunization from 3 to 11 vaccines, and it was not understood. I think we took it from granted that you had a mandatory vaccine and recommended vaccine because at a certain time everybody got the vaccines, and then but people were confused about the difference. So so mandatory immunization from 3 to 11. We decided on increase and improve communication with a dedicated website. When you will look at for immunization vaccine, we will try to be referenced, not only the rubbish that you can find on the web on vaccination, and we'll try to focus not only on anti-vaccine persons, because obviously there are more or less 5% of real anti-vaccines, but on the hesitance one, because I think it's important to provide those people, as you said, with information, because they're looking for information. Promote peer-to-peer communication at school. We will promote this youth ambassador initiative. It works in different places in the world, so we will launch such kind of initiative. Simplify the immunization pathway for user. We will have vaccination at pharmacy, stocks in general practitioner, pediatrician, so it's easy. You don't have to go to the general practitioner, then get here and then buy your... So we'll try to simplify all the pathway. Citizens will be provided by 2020 with an electronic immunization record, mobile health application, which shows your status, some automatic reminder for vaccine deadlines, etc. So just to try to ease the way you can get immunization. Of course, we'll have dedicated measures for fostering immunization of health professionals and really strengthening the initial training of health professionals. And we have a new initiative called Service Sanitaire, so health service. It will start this year, and it's a 3 months training model with really practical exercise dedicated to the medical students, but also students in pharmacy, nursing, paramedics. It's 47,000 students, and their training will include visit to school, visit to retirement homes, health center all over France, just to put in practice the communications on prevention. They will go in different places, talk with the people, explain the prevention, and try to engage the people into prevention. I think it will help, to move from healthcare system to more, system inclusive in terms of prevention. And of course, we have measures, for the implementation of short-term management plan, development of clinical, so interventional research studies. And that's it.
Thank you very much. France, as Heidi has shown, is one of the countries where vaccine hesitancy is higher in the European Union. So you are developing a lot of activities and focus activities, and let's see what is the result in some years. So now we have Dr. Klaus Hichutek from the Paul-Ehrlich Institute in Germany.
Thanks very much. I'm coming from a little bit different angle, so I'm going to switch gears. Let me explain the angle we are having. The Paul-Ehrlich Institute, as I may have told you earlier, is regulating vaccines and biomedicines in Germany and also in Europe, and we have a long outreach also internationally and globally, so to speak, working a lot with WHO. So from this kind of perspective, I have to say, first of all, we believe that vaccines are the best measure to prevent any infectious diseases when we look at the Ebola crisis and things like these. And part of the vaccine problem is a little bit the availability and distribution. I will go into that because part of this session is also talking about supplies, so to speak. And of course, one issue with having the right supply is then getting people to be vaccinated, that is getting high vaccination rates in the relevant target populations. Now let me go from this angle one by one. We have talked today a little bit about research and development of new vaccines, and I think these are very important interventions, and I think that regulatory institutions like ours can really help there by, first of all, being part of the academic scene that's doing a lot of translational science and trying to develop new ideas about new vaccines. We need new vaccines for existing protection. If you think of, let's say, the issues we have with the vaccine effectiveness of the seasonal influenza vaccine, some other vaccines are very good. I think some improvements can be made, and I think it's a very good idea to support this kind of research on new vaccine issues and new vaccine platforms, as we've told. Now, in that respect, I think regulatory institutions like the Paul-Ehrlich Institute and many others can actually support by providing early advice, and we actually entertain good collaboration also on the research and the regulatory angle with health research centers from the academic side, and we are part of this scene, and we provide very early advice, and that is very helpful. And in that respect, my recommendation actually to anybody supporting translational research, supporting that, be it Commission, be it Bill, Melinda Gates, or any others, come to vaccine experts from the regulatory side like the Paul-Ehrlich Institute and talk to us early on and make that actually a mandatory requirement for any translational science support you're giving, because only then will we have targeted product development that will really help and will be sustainable. Now let me come to the second issue, which is the supply issue we're talking about here. If you're looking at supply, I've looked up some WHO numbers, and it's very interesting to see that the shortage we're facing is not only a shortage on a global level in less industrialized countries, but we have quite a number of shortage problems also in industrialized countries like Germany, and I'll go into some solutions for this one in a minute. But in comparison to, let's say, less industrialized countries, there the issues are often procurement delay or the stock management issues, which we usually don't face, but it's rather quality issues and other issues for shortages. And actually the global number has increased during the last years in that respect. So what have we done in Germany to assure vaccine availability and supply? We have made a legal provision clearly in our drug law that gives responsibility to the vaccine manufacturers to have suitable supply on the German market. And we have an annual roundtable of manufacturers, public health and regulatory authorities discussing these issues and finding solutions. But of course, we are continuously also in communication with each other. And there is also a vaccine shortages information system that we've built up on the webpage of the Paul-Ehrlich Institute. That is pei.de, if you want to look it up. It's rather only in Germany currently, but that will be improved later. Anyway, in terms of tackling the supply issues, we have come to an agreement with the vaccine manufacturers that they're willing to give us immediate information if they're expecting a supply issue. And that's very important. And we have defined different supply issues, which are, for example, a shortage simply of a vaccine product size, a package size. There are supply issues where we have immediate alternative vaccines that can be used. And number three, there's also the possibility that we have to come to alternative vaccination recommendations, and we do that together with our vaccination recommendation committee at the Robert Koch Institute in Germany. And that is an agreement that the vaccine manufacturers have deliberately made with us just to make sure that they will actually secure supply on the market. And I think that's a very good way forward. And if you look at the records of the last 2 years that we have, is that, let's say, in most of the cases, there were only issues with the package sizes. However, in terms of vaccine hesitancy, that is sometimes an issue. I want to point out that we get reports and telephone calls from pediatricians if children have to be vaccinated twice with 2 needle sticks instead of 1. And in that respect, we know that developments like patches or nasal things will be improved. Now, anyway, just to say that also in Germany we had supply issues that extended for more than 100 days in some instances, many of them between 30 and 100 days. That's on supply. I would like to make another remark which extends to preparing less industrialized countries for crises. We have a global health program that we entertain, and we're working together with the NEPAD, that is New African Development Coalition. And we are partnering here with regulators in African member states and countries that need to be prepared to be aware of the crisis. They need to be prepared to give objective information on vaccines, that's on vaccine hesitancy, but they also need to be prepared in order to be ready for the vaccine clinical trials that commercial developers have to do once a pandemic comes along. And we entertain with them good connections, and we hope we'll be better. Now, last point, I think in terms of vaccine hesitancy, it has a value that authorities like ours can give objective information that is avoids any conflicts of interest on vaccines, on their safety. But we're facing problems here because we get a lot of calls and also inquiries from people that are vaccine skeptics. And those kind of people we feel can be convinced by providing good information on vaccines, on vaccine safety and effectiveness. But there is a second population part of this. These are people that are ignorant about science and they don't believe in scientific facts. And this is very hard to tackle, and maybe somebody in the panel can give me advice on how to tackle these kind of target populations, because we've tried all over again to discuss with them, to provide information, but they're coming back with irrational information. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The other country where vaccination has become a political issue, and even in the electoral program of some of the parties, is Italy. So what are you doing to
I
tackle
won't
that?
say if we won or we didn't anyway.
Okay,
Anyway.
so Giovanni Reza from the Infectious Diseases, Department of Infectious Diseases at the National Institute of Health.
Gracias. But actually, we were the bad boys in this score, but because we actually scored second in terms of number of cases of measles last year in Europe, just after Romania. But for that reason, actually, there was kind of a reaction by the government, and I will tell you the story very briefly. So up to a few years ago, we were convinced, actually, that the era of mandatory vaccines was going to finish, was going to end. And but between 2013 and 15, there was a dramatic decline in terms of vaccination coverage. We had 4 mandatory vaccines, and the vaccination coverage decreased from more than 95 to 93.5% for these 4 vaccines. And with regard to measles, the decrease was from 90% to 85%. We did a national survey on more than 3,000 individuals that showed that about 84% of parents were in favor of vaccines, but something less than 1% was anti-vaccine, and about 16% declared they were vaccine hesitant. So we actually investigated the determinants of vaccine hesitancy, and the vaccine hesitancy was associated to not having received recommendations to fully vaccinate from pediatricians, or having received discordant opinions from pediatricians, or having met parents of children experiencing severe adverse reactions, or using non-traditional medical treatments associated with hesitancy, like homeopathy in particular. Last year we had this large outbreak of measles with more than 5,000 cases. But I think that the perception of the outbreak was quite low among the population, because it's anecdotal, but you continuously meet people that say, oh, what is 5,000 cases of measles? I had measles when I was young, and I survived without any consequences. So, the risk perception, I think, with regard to this outbreak was quite low in the population. And also those parties who were against law enforcement, they had this point of view. This is not an outbreak. This is just natural, the natural dynamic of the epidemics of measles. You get waves of measles every 3 years. So this is the usual epidemic dynamic. Also because before starting vaccination programs 20 years ago, we had 80,000 cases of measles. So it was quite difficult to convince that in Europe today you shouldn't have any case of measles. And that was one of the major points also of the political debate. So in July 2017, so last year, the government decided we need mandatory to reinforce the legislation about vaccination, and so 10 vaccines became mandatory for the access to school, and plus, 4 vaccines that were just recommended. I think we can already design draw some preliminary, let's say conclusion, because we just got data from 5 regions and 1 municipality, and these data show a dramatic increase in vaccination coverage for the birth cohorts 2015 and 2016. So we have now, we estimate a vaccination coverage of about 96% for the vaccines that are included in the hexavalent formulation, and so an increase of 2.5%, and we estimate a coverage of 93.6% for measles, the measles vaccine, so measles, mumps, and rubella. So maybe someone can say, this is just a shortcut. People are not convinced. We should convince people instead of introducing mandatory vaccination. And I think that the political debate will continue also because unfortunately, I have to say unfortunately, vaccines became one of the issues in the political campaign for the elections. And you know that 2 or the 3 parties that actually gain votes actually are against this new legislation. And we don't know actually which will be the government, and if the new government will make some decisions against this new legislation. They are not against vaccines, of course, but they say, we don't need this law enforcement. Before concluding, I want to just say that this law is appreciated by most of the scientific community anyway, but we still have problems with healthcare workers in particular, because we have a very low vaccination coverage among healthcare workers with regard to influenza, with regard to measles, and there's no law enforcement possible in this and feasible in this case. And also there is a strong demand for actually, let's say, monovalent formulations of vaccines, especially for tetanus. I think that anyway, this is one of the problems we face when we introduce mandatory vaccination. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. For many years, we thought that polyvalent vaccination, in the same way that we are talking about polypills, are the future, and now we are back to the monovalent. And for just one thing that I don't completely agree is that, yes, we have an instrument to enforce for health workers, but that we will discuss another day, maybe. And now, finally, Pascal Morin, Vaccines Europe. So. We have seen in presentations and that people don't trust you. So thank you. the industry is, well, the devil in a way. So there is the distrust in vaccines, and then you are creating problems because there are shortages and not supply. So what are you doing?
Thank you for the introduction. So I first would like to thank the organizer for inviting us, Vaccines Europe, to this important discussion. And I guess it's important to really have the discussion on a collaborative way and finding the right solution, because we all agree, that's what I heard, that the importance of vaccination. And so vaccination has made the greatest contribution to global health as part from introduction of clean water and sanitation. According to WHO, immunization is a proven tool for controlling and eliminating life-threatening infectious disease, and is estimated to avert between 2 and 3 million deaths each year. So vaccines have as well demonstrated a key role in reducing AMR. I guess it's a short introduction, but it's important to remind that our vaccination is important. And it has been for the last years as a given that vaccination should be done, but it proves that with the vaccines hesitancy growing, that is not a given. And that we have to work together to really improve the situation. So, but perhaps first of all, let me start by presenting who we are. So Vaccines Europe is a specialized vaccines group within the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industry and Association, so EFPIA, the professional association of the pharmaceutical industry in Europe. So Vaccines Europe was formed in 1991 and represents the major innovative research-based companies as well as small and medium-sized enterprises operating in Europe with a count of a large share of human vaccines used worldwide. Companies represented within Vaccines Europe are involved in research and development, clinical trials, production and marketing of vaccines, and are dedicated to improving public health through immunization. So what is our role? How do we see our role as an industry in ensuring vaccines uptake and increasing vaccine confidence? First of all, of course, is to continue to develop innovative, safe, and effective vaccines to address unmet medical need, as well as including targeting AMR pathogens. Second is manufacturing and deliver the vaccines with high-quality standard and secure the capacity. So I guess it's important. I give you an example for PCV13. It takes approximately 2.5 years to manufacture the product, involving 1,700 employees, 581 manufacturing steps, and 678 quality tests before the vaccine reached clinic, doctors, and patients. So why do I say that? Because the dialogue, the early dialogue and continuous dialogue, what we heard here in Germany, I guess is important. It's important to have dialogue to anticipate a program, new program implementation and changes in programs, and to anticipate if there is on our side any issue coming, anticipate this issue. So the dialogue is key. Third is to continue to engage in public and private partnering to enhance vaccine evidence-based data to strengthen the confidence on vaccination. And some IMI projects have already been mentioned, like ADVANCE for the monitoring risk-benefit. So that's the third one. The fourth one is to continue to partnering with organizations like Gavi or CEPI to expand and secure people access to vaccination, including the one who need the most. It's logistics, delivery systems, and of course, vaccines. And last is, as an expert in vaccination, of course, provides a fact-based information on the vaccines to support awareness or education programs, including, of course, the safety that we have seen is very important. We have pharmacovigilance system, so we of course, we are a key stakeholder for the dialogue here. So I just would like to end my speech on our vision on the key elements to address, considering for boosting vaccines confidence in Europe. So first of all, we think that strengthens the European surveillance capabilities to better assess infectious disease patterns, vaccines benefit risk, vaccination uptake, and impact of vaccines across all ages is important, because that's the data that will allow to support design and adaptation of national immunization strategies, as well as public education around immunization programs. The second is a continuous training and education of healthcare professionals. We have seen there are really the key reliable person to refer in the majority of the case. So including curricula, that's really, we think it's a very, very good initiatives. Developing information immunization system is important, and though that there can be as well reminder system, because as well, that's one of the issues sometimes is just they forget. So third is to facilitate the people access to vaccination. I'm very happy to hear the initiative in France, because that as well could be a barrier when the people access to vaccination, the patient journey, I would say, is too complicated. And last is really to continue to monitor the acceptance attitudes, to understand and be able to develop the right tool and communication. So in conclusion, ensuring vaccination uptake by boosting vaccines confidence for us is a multi-stakeholder engagement from scientists, governments, EU institutions, healthcare professionals, civil society, and vaccines industry. The dialogue is key, and the dialogue should lead to public-private partnership in the benefit of EU individuals and public health benefit. In a changing demographic shift with an aging population, it will be more and more important. So vaccination is one of the most cost-effective health investment and needs to be considered and recognized for public health sustainability. So as vaccines industry, as I said, we are committed to continue to develop innovative, safe, and effective vaccines and to protect EU and worldwide population. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we pass to the questions, remarks, observations from the public. Volunteers, who is the first one that has a question? Nobody? Okay, then, okay. It's not compulsory. If you want, come here.
Hello, Lawrence Marzal from CoU. I guess a question to Klaus, really. You spoke about supply issues in Germany and passing sort of certain legislation or something like that. But isn't it just a case of business continuity? So in security and resilience terms, we, and in the private sector, we are required some legislation, some statutory documents to have business continuity in place. Surely in the case of things, infections and viruses and so on, where there is a critical health issue, shouldn't there be some form of business continuity plan and procedures and perhaps even legislation in place to ensure that there's always a continuity of supply?
Yeah, first of all, I mentioned, yes, we have legal requirements, but I don't think that legal requirements are the answer to things, really. It's a question of collaboration. Number two, no, it's not a question of just business continuity. We're not facing the supply issues because we have a crisis and there is abundant sudden need of the vaccine, although that's part of our definition of vaccine shortages. They can be due to increased demand that has not been expected, for example, that happens. And number three, I think it was mentioned that some of the vaccines need years to formulate from the manufacturer, from putting them together. And actually, I want to also make a point that I think that combination vaccines are a very effective tool to vaccinate against many different infectious diseases. That's very important because you talked a little bit about monovalent vaccines that we are in need of as well, but the combination vaccines for the basic vaccination, that's very important. Anyway, coming to the reasons and causes for supply issues, it is very often the case that it's simply quality and GMP issues. Not so much that the vaccine is not of high quality, but all the different controls that were mentioned may fail at some point or another. There are so many of them. And that needs to rigorously be researched. And that sometimes takes some time, and therefore the supply cannot be there. And there is another issue that I think is on a political level. Of course, vaccine manufacturers work in order to provide us with vaccines, but they also need to make money with the vaccines. And that means they calculate quite roughly the number of vaccine doses they need in a certain year. That must be an art by itself. Maybe you can tell us how that works. But of course, there is not a high overdose, meaning that they just work to what is expected to be needed. And that may be something that on a political scale can be worked on. Maybe there could be a little bit more being done in order to avoid such shortages. That may be a way forward, but that would mean that the vaccines are more expensive, and that's another issue that would support vaccine hesitancy.
So just a quick word. It's also a shared responsibility with member states because if you have mandatory vaccine, then there's liability issues, I mean, with the population.
Okay, more questions?
My name is Lise Bouya. I'm from the Leuven University Vaccinology Center. And in the context of a transdisciplinary project of our university, we challenged a few students from our university with the thing we called the vaccine hesitancy challenge. And basically the idea is that students from different faculties from our university, so we have students from law, from ethics, from pedagogics, from pharmacy, from medicine, that they have a look at the vaccine hesitancy concept. And now they already have explored a lot in literature, and nowadays they are like doing interviews with different stakeholders. So I'm talking about like social media experienced people, people who are making movies, people, who are in vaccines, different kind of things. So I just quickly wanted to take the opportunity to ask if someone who wants to collaborate, that can be through means of a Skype meeting, and let students do an interview with you. If you can contribute, that would be really appreciated. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So a call has been made.
Yeah.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Yeah.
Yeah, I work for the Commission, but I come from a personal point of view. I was wondering if there is a link between the way it's compulsory to vaccine someone and the reluctance, the hesitancy. Because I think that could be, I wonder if it has been studied, and I think it's something difficult, it can be difficult to accept to be vaccinated suddenly against 11 disease. If you could have the choice to do 6 and not more. I wonder, because really, I think when discussing with people around me, even as I'm a scientist, I hear a lot of time, this is a problem for the people. They would like to choose. So I wonder if you have any study about this.
They used to have the choice.
Yeah, they had the
they
choice.
used to have the choice, and we see, I mean, the results. So, I mean, we've taken, I mean, just this step to clarify also this, yeah, where the important, let's
because
say,
I know
vaccines,
in Belgium it's not
but,
compulsory, and I think the people are taking the vaccine. But if you say suddenly you need to vaccinate for 11 diseases, people will say, "Oh my God."
What strikes me is they say that, for example, in Sweden it's not compulsory, but it's untrue because your child can't enter nursery school. They don't have vaccines, but it's not say like that, right? So it's a matter also of communication sometimes.
I guess in the time where people are against fake news and things like this, it's really something you have to take care, I guess.
I think one of the points you mentioned actually is Sweden. One of the points is that there are several ecological studies comparing different countries which have different policies and looking at the outcome. I mean, that is vaccine coverage. And that's, you can get fictitious results actually because it's the epidemiological fallacia. So you compare apples with pears or with something, with some other fruits. That's the point. Sweden is a 5 million country. France and Italy have a bit more. And health literacy also is lower. For example, in our country, health literacy is quite low compared to Northern Europe. So, of course, you have to adapt policies to the real environment, to the situation. That is one of the points. So we are not sure that, of course, this is the only way to fight vaccine hesitancy. Maybe it's not a way to fight vaccine hesitancy, but it's a shortcut to obtain higher vaccine coverage. But there are some times in which it's very difficult to act in a different way. So we were obliged in some way to adopt this policy because vaccination coverage was going down.
Almost all countries have laws that protect the general goods from the private goods. So you don't vaccine just to protect yourself, you vaccinate to protect the rest of the population, all the population, and especially the ones that cannot be vaccinated because they are quite sick, or etc. 1, 2, 3 vaccines, well, I don't know. There are other areas of life where you are obliged and nobody complains. I mean, you want to drive a motorbike, you need to wear a helmet. You want to drive a car, you need to have a license. You are obliged to go to school when you are 6 or 7, according to the country. So, and nobody really complains about that. And maybe, well, many of people here, of us here, are old enough to have suffered measles. I have suffered, and many of you, and we are still here. But my cousin, she died. We had the measles at the same time. She is in the cemetery, I am here. So I studied with 2 girls, 1 girl and 1 boy, that had polio. So it seems that people have forgotten where we were before and how all the benefits that we have today. So please take that into account also. So, yes.
Yeah, I would like to, let's say, go against some vaccine myth right here on the podium and in the audience. There are not 11 infectious diseases that we can vaccinate against in one shot. That's not doable. It's hexavalent vaccines that we have. They're excellent. And we have MMR and MRV. So it's 4 then in a shot. That's about it. If at all, we have against certain variants of one pathogen vaccines that contain 11 subtypes or 13 or something like that. Number 1. Number 2, it's only a myth that our immune system can't cope with that. On the contrary, we are currently facing all kinds of microbes and infectious agents floating around us, and we can face them. There's no problem with it. Number 3, there are people that go against vaccines and they're vaccine hesitant in countries where we have compulsory and mandatory vaccination, and also in countries that are rather liberal about this, like in Germany. There are all kinds of reasons. I also have a question, actually. Number one, I would anyway think that we should concentrate on those that are complacent and skeptic, but not concentrate on the very, very minor number of those that we can never convince. That can simply be forgotten. And number two, those of you here on the panel or in the audience that try to study these kind of people, we would welcome a solution, how to convince those people that are only complacent and are skeptics.
Yeah. We need to move to the conclusion, so 2 small interventions and the last one.
I think mandatory vaccination can, of course, meet some resistance, as it was said. On the other hand, totally free vaccination can also just lead to complacency. And there's another solution in between, actually, for some countries that are contemplating going either way. I think Germany is thinking about this, and I've actually been contacted by some of your panel members. There's, of course, the possibility, to raise to make it not too easy not to vaccinate. So if you decide conscientiously not to be vaccinated, you have to get an exemption. And getting this exemption, you can make it easy or slightly more complicated, or more, you have different ways of making it more complicated. And then you will have a lot of those that are just complacent that will be vaccinated. And I think you can reach a lot by not making it mandatory per se, but just making it more difficult not to be vaccinated.
Yeah, an opt-out kind of system. So the last one.
Caterina Berbeni-Reum. I am speaking here as a mother. So I'm not a scientist, I'm not a manager, just taking the perspective of a citizen and of a mother. And I would agree with the last suggestions. I think it's a sign of non-respect if we say, we tell you what you have to do for the sake of your family, for the sake of the people. What I would ask as a mother is, where is the evidence in the studies that you are doing? Yeah? Between, for example, and don't see it as a challenge, but just as a thought that is coming up. In the past, there was the experience saying, let children have muscles, and then they build antibody. Yeah? And today we say, let's avoid it. The evidence-based, let me say, data that show evidence what is best of it. Do we have it? Because this would be the key to convince everybody, saying, in the past it was this. Now we have evidence from a scientific point of view that it can be better.
When we talk about measles, the rate of becoming a lethal disease from measles infection for children is 1 to 1,000. Any complications with the vaccine is 1,000-fold lower, that's 1 to 1 million. We're all, also the scientists among us, are mothers and fathers. And we provide vaccines to our children because we know they're safe. And if you look at how they are marketed, there are lots of clinical trial data. That's the highest evidence we can have that they're safe and efficacious.
We we have measles outbreak, so we have data. 400 cases, less than 400 cases in France, 1 death, 32-year-old women, right? She could, okay. 82 serious cases, hospitalized. So, okay. So you know, so just to avoid also this.
Yeah.
There is another point, please.
Yeah.
Excuse me. That we had 4 deaths from measles last year and 2 deaths this year. And the point is that all these individuals, actually, who died, were fragile individuals, immunosuppressed. So if you don't vaccinate the other one, since the basic reproductive number of measles is very high, so you need very high coverage in order to avoid or reduce the circulation of measles. That's the point. So you get to vaccinate the other to protect the few who are immunosuppressed.
I want you to be advocatus diaboli.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Now we go to the conclusions. Line?
Yeah. So, first of all, thanks to the panel, and let us give them a hand. And I also want to thank all the speakers, all the other panelists, the chairs, and you for a lively discussion. I think at least one point where that was highlighted by everybody and where I think we all can agree is that infectious diseases is not a problem of yesterday or the last century, but actually a problem of today. And it is here to stay, and it's a question on when, where, and what will be the next outbreak. Clearly, research is a key for having an efficient preparedness and response to future outbreaks. We have also seen today that we have invested a lot in various networks, activities, which is good. I think we have really built a good capacity, a good activities in this field over the last years. The challenge now is to try to bring these activities together and not make more fragmentation, but actually try to bring it together, which will clearly be one of our key objectives in the future, both from the research perspective, but also how to bring this together with the public health authorities. We started the day with discussing the importance of surveillance and early detection, and also to address the challenging issue of sharing data, samples, etc. So issues that are not easy, but I think at least what is important is that we are now able to put the challenge on the table. We don't have the answer, but we know what the problem is, which is already a step ahead. We talked a lot about the importance of capacity building in, and I would like to stress, not only outside Europe, but also inside Europe, to make sure that we continue to invest in the capacities to respond. And of course, also Europe is not forgetting the developing or the low and middle income countries, and both from the research perspective, but also from our colleagues in the development program, indeed support these countries in making sure that they are better prepared for new outbreaks. We discussed the importance of clinical trial networks, and I think here one of the key messages, so a lot have been done from us, from our side, also for other funders, but a key message I think was the importance also of making strong networks of laboratories that are specialized in diagnostics, so networks of laboratories, and indeed bridge that with the clinical trials. So something that I think is important to address in the future. We discussed the importance, of course, of continue to fill the pipeline of countermeasures. And here, I think it's clear also from our experience with Ebola, etc., that the big pharmaceutical companies, of course, play a role. They are the ones that can make the production of the vaccines, etc. But it is very important, and I say at least that is something that the Commission is very keen to continue to discuss and make sure is that we also fund our innovative SMEs, because the innovation is often coming not, Johan, sorry to maybe say, I don't know if there are other big companies in the room, but often today the innovation is not coming from the big companies, but actually coming from academia and SMEs. So it's key to make sure that the innovators of today, that we indeed stimulate them and then build it in and make the bridge between these and the bigger companies that are essential. We talked about the importance of push mechanisms. Then our last session, I think, also highlighted, and it came also in some of the other sessions, is the challenge of governance and the challenge of trust in governments, behavioral issues, again, something we also witnessed during the Ebola outbreak, the importance of understanding the behavior of the communities, but also to engage with the communities and have their buy-in, essentially if you want to do clinical trials. So from a research perspective, it's an area, the social sciences is something where we have, in my view, not invested enough. So I can only make the criticism to myself or to the Commission, because I've been in charge of infectious disease research, but we are trying to repair that, because we actually have in our call out where we try to establish a network of social scientists that can work across continents to address the social sciences questions, including also how do we actually, what are the recommendations we can make to have a better governance, and also the trust. I think it's very important to have, as we also just discussed, the evidence base for actually taking the political actions. So with this, I want to thank also my colleagues, in particular Barbara and Birgit, who have been key in organizing this event, as well as our colleague from DD Home, who are organizing these sessions during the whole week. Because without them, we would not be here today. So I have just tried to put you together and made sure that we finish at 5 o'clock, but they have really been key, so I would like to ask you to give them a hand. And with this, I want to thank you again, and I'm sure this will not be the end of a discussion. There are many other issues and continuation of the open questions that we need to discuss. So I hope you will enjoy the evening. I think there's also a cocktail being organized. So nice to see you. Thanks a lot for your contribution to the discussion.
Yeah.